The day that she had both of her boys, she just had this smile on her face like, I got what I wanted.
She was the little sister who was always the center of attention.
She's free as the wind, she's lighthearted, but she really needed help.
That seems to bring her closer to her sister.
But one sister's joy is another's breaking point.
She couldn't get pregnant, and her sister's on number 2.
Her envy, her hope, her desires to be a mom were so overwhelming.
That's when I think the wheels started really turning.
A twisted scheme forms.
She starts this lie and continues this lie for 9 months, but she didn't come up with an end game.
With a catastrophic ending.
I love all my sisters, don't get me wrong. But why would you take your own sister's life? Josie was my sister. She always had a loving smile on her face. As you can see, this is her smile. I'll never forget it. She was amazing. I mean, she had a heart of gold. When she took her last breath, I could feel it. It was like my life just was gone. Like there was nothing there.
Born in 1981, Josie Merrifield grew up in a blended family and one of 7 sisters.
First is Bobby, then there's me, then there's Sandy Merrifield, then Eileen, and then Josie. They are twins. Then there's Crystal Merrifield, and then there's April Merrifield. Bobby, me, Josie, Eileen, and Crystal, we all have the same mother. Sandy has a different mother.
Being among the oldest, Sandy naturally became a caretaker for her younger sisters.
Sandy was teaching them how to read, how to write, cooking, making sure all the kids had food in their bellies and their homework assignments done. Complete opposite of Sandy is her younger sister, Josie. She's not strict, she's not reserved, she's free as the wind, she's lighthearted, she's fun.
I mean, she got in trouble, she cussed and stuff like that when she was little, but she always walked in God's path. She would do anything for anybody. She'd give you the clothes off her back, she'd give you the shoes off her feet.
At the age of 14, Josie is suddenly forced to grow up fast.
We found out that Josie was pregnant. It was a blessing.
In November of 1996, Josie delivers a healthy baby boy.
Josie gives birth to her first child, Jordan, and that seems to bring her closer to her sister, Sandy.
As a teenage mother, Josie really needed help. Sandy was there. Sandy knew how to cook, how to take care of babies. She'd been doing it her whole life.
At the same time, 19-year-old Sandy is eager to start a family of her own.
As most big sisters, there comes a time when it's time for you to flee the nest, to move on, and that's what Sandy was trying to do. She was in a relationship with a new boyfriend named Everett.
They were always loving each other. They was always together.
Sandy's boyfriend, Everett, was a plumber. He was trying to get his plumbing business off the ground. Sandy herself was in school, becoming a CNA, a certified nurse's assistant.
They have a lot of opportunity ahead of them. Good jobs, a good stable situation to be able to start a family with, which Sandy's well equipped for.
They kept trying to have babies, and Sandy kept having miscarriages, and that took a lot on her.
The doctor told her she would never have kids.
Then, in early 1999, both sisters enter an exciting and surprising new chapter in life.
One day, Josie met a man named Chester. Chester and Josie hit it off.
She was more into Chester than she was anybody.
She's so enamored. She finally found somebody. And so there's a lot of happiness and excitement. And shortly afterwards, Josie becomes pregnant. And then, come to find out, Sandy's pregnant too. Well, wonderful news, right? And what a bonding experience for sisters to have. It's like now we can share our pregnancy together.
In August 1999, 18-year-old Josie is ready to welcome her second son, Jasper, into the world.
Can we talk about the day Jasper was born?
Jasper was born on the 11th. Every night that she was at the hospital, she'd call, and Jordan would get on the phone. Mommy, when you coming home? When you bring my brother home? You know, he was all excited about his little brother coming home. I mean, I wish that she could be here and be with her kid and stuff like that and make a relationship with him. But God didn't see it that way.
It's just past dinner time in Collinsville, Illinois, when a man and woman approach the desk officer at the police department.
I went out in the lobby, and there's a gentleman holding a newborn baby in a pumpkin seat, and a girl. And the girl I was familiar with, she was one of the Merrifield sisters.
It's a big family. I mean, still a lot of Merrifields in Collinsville. Some of them were very troubled. Some of them were not. Sandra had never really been involved in a whole lot. She was kind of quiet. You know, wasn't really involved in the family drama.
The man accompanying Sandy is her boyfriend, Everett.
And he said that, you know, she wants to tell you something. And I said, okay. It's kind of odd that, you know, they're standing there and she's kind of hanging her head. And nobody said anything. Everett's like, go ahead, tell him what you need to tell him. And I said, what do you need to tell me? She said, I killed my sister today.
Inside the Collinsville, Illinois Police Department, 22-year-old Sandra Merrifield has just made a shocking confession.
I received a phone call from this dispatcher, and she said, we have an issue in the station. Sandra Merrifield just came in here and said she killed her sister. And I was like, what? I said, what sister? Because we were familiar with the family. She said, I think Josie. I said, okay, we're en route. It's kind of hard to believe a story like that. I mean, is she really dead?
It's highly unusual that your first contact with a murder suspect, that they're already confessing.
When I went there, I noticed Sandra in the lobby with her boyfriend.
Also present with the couple is a newborn baby.
Sandy's just standing there with her head bowed, not really speaking, just kind of staring at the floor.
She was more or less, you know, trying to tell me as little as possible.
And she said she could take us to the body. I still had doubts. It just seems too far-fetched, you know.
Detective Sergeant Capitelli and I put Sandy in an unmarked police vehicle, and we asked her to show us where she had left her sister's body.
We stopped at a couple locations, and there was nothing there. And then we pulled up to another location, and she says, yes, that's it.
It was dark. It was beyond dusk. She pointed out where we would find her sister if we walked just a few feet off of the road and looked into a creek.
We looked under the bridge, and I think Major Delmore was the first one to spot her.
Josie was face down in the creek. Face was covered with water, although her entire body wasn't covered with water. Obviously deceased. So at that point, we know we have a murder.
She also had a large open wound on her head.
One thing that stood out to me is that she was wearing a hospital band that indicated to me that she had just recently been released from the hospital.
While the coroner removes Josie's body from the scene, detectives transport Sandy back to headquarters, where they're met by members of the Merrifield family.
We were standing on the steps of the police department.
Detective Sergeant Capitelli made death notification to the family.
My mama almost fell on the ground. If it wasn't for my dad grabbing her, you just heard screams everywhere. It was like nonstop screaming. They wasn't telling us too much of anything. They just said that Sandy took him out there to where he killed Josie.
While Sandy is led into an interrogation room, detectives shift their focus to her boyfriend.
He was wanting to tell us very quickly what was going on.
Everett was looked at by the county, interviewed several avenues to see if he had anything to do with this.
You have been in this relationship with Sandra Merrifield for approximately 3 years?
3 years.
Okay, and both Josie Merrifield and Sandra Merrifield were pregnant, is that correct?
Yes.
That day, he indicated that he was at work, got home at 5:30 in the afternoon.
He seen Josie's son, Jordan, in the house. Sandy was in the back room.
Okay, so you go into the bedroom, and what do you see there?
There's a newborn baby. And the first thing, I'm like, well, where's Josie? She goes, well, Josie's with Chester, and they've got the baby. I'm, well, who baby is this? She said, this is your baby.
Did she tell you she had the baby at a hospital?
No, she said her water broke in the car, and she got to the doctor's office, and she had the baby at the doctor's office.
She said, look what happened today when I went to the doctor's office. I delivered a baby, and they sent me home. Here's your son.
I said, what name did you put on the birth certificate for his name? She said, Edward Crenshaw Jackson.
Everett takes Jordan back to the Merrifield house, and when he gets there, he sees all of the other sisters.
Crystal answers the door, and she goes, where's Sandy? Where's Josie? Where's the baby?
So when he dropped off Jordan, he's like, have you seen Josie? And she said, my mom and Joe said, no, Sandy took her to the gas station and we haven't seen neither one of them. He said, well, Sandy is at home with our new baby.
That's when everyone became concerned for Josie and her newborn baby, Jasper.
I kept saying to myself, something's not right. Something is not right. But, I'm still excited. Hey, I'm a father.
Everett's like, okay, Sandy said that Chester took Josie and the baby.
Detectives learn that Chester is Josie's boyfriend and the father of their infant son.
And then Chester shows up and says, where's Josie? And they said, well, she's supposed to be with you. And he's like, no, she's not with me. And that's when I think Everett, the wheels started really turning with Everett that, okay, something's not right here.
I must have burned that highway up going back to the house. I pulled up in the yard. I walked into the house.
You're questioning Sandy.
I'm questioning Sandy. I'm like, something's not right here.
where's Josie? She said that Josie was gone. Josie left with someone. I'm like, left with who? Chester? I'm like, bull. What happened to Josie? That's when she got real scared. That's when she got nervous. Then that's when she got to asking me to sit down. I was like, what happened to Josie? What happened to Josie? She's gone. She's not coming back.
In an interview with detectives, Everett Jackson recounts the moment he confronted his girlfriend, Sandra Merrifield, about her 18-year-old sister's whereabouts.
She was sitting there like she wasn't nothing wrong. She was just as close to me.
Her demeanor was frighteningly calm to you.
Yeah.
He felt at that point he had to do something, and so he brought her here.
Okay. So to summarize what has happened here is we have two sisters, both were pregnant at the same time.
Same time.
And this sister Josie had her baby
on the 11th.
On the 11th. And at some point in time today, Sandra must have had her baby.
Right.
This was not a whodunit homicide. This is one where we knew very quickly, immediately, who the suspect was because she walked in the door and confessed.
We didn't believe that Everett was involved.
If Everett's story is true, one infant remains unaccounted for. So detectives decide to take a closer look at the baby Sandy claimed is hers.
Sergeant Capitelli told me to go up and, make sure the baby was okay, and also, see if they can do an identity on it too. So we went to the ward up there, maternity section of the hospital. I met with one of the nurses. So then they took new footprints from Sandy and Everett's baby, got the ones on file from their sister's baby. And then the nurse did a comparison there. And, based on their knowledge, they said that they believe that was, they matched up.
The nurse said, yes, I did deliver that baby. That's Josie's son, Jasper.
The nurse indicated that she had taken care of that baby the day before.
They know that the baby that Sandy has is Josie's baby, but there's still the unresolved question of Sandy's original story, that she gave birth at the doctor's office and had the baby. So where's your baby?
Sandy is taken to the Madison County Sheriff's Department for questioning.
So I sat down with her and I told her that we were going to talk about the events that took place that day.
Okay. And on August the 12th, 1999, were you pregnant at that time?
Yes.
That's when she proceeds to tell police officers that I was experiencing labor pains. I went to a walking trail around Horseshoe Lake to do some walking to see if I could walk through some of the labor pains.
Okay, and about how far along were you with that pregnancy?
About 8 months.
About 8 months.
She said the pains got worse. So she walked across the road into a wooded area and delivered a child. From her certified nurse's training, she recognized that the child was not breathing, he was blue. And she said it did not have a pulse.
After you determined that that child was not alive, what did you do with that child?
Turn it around. Put it in the way.
She says, I was so distraught, I tossed the baby in the lake. It's just a terrible situation.
We were going to have to do our absolute 100% best to try to locate that baby if it was in the water.
The  .
After you determined that that child was not alive, what did you do with that child?
hours before she confessed to killing her newly postpartum sister, Josie. 22-year-old Sandra Merrifield claims she gave birth to a stillborn baby boy.
She says, as soon as the baby was born, I was able to check for a pulse and heartbeat, and I knew right then it was stillborn. I saw the umbilical cord around the neck, and I was so distraught, I tossed the baby in the lake.
So they took her to that lake. They had her show them the area where she says she put her deceased newborn into the water.
You know, we searched the area a little bit to see if there was any indication that a child had been born in that area, and we couldn't find anything.
They still had to take the steps, appropriately so, to confirm that what she's saying could not have happened. They had a dive team there.
So then the divers then just went ahead and went in the water and started doing their thing. I explained to her, I said, I just want you to know that, you know, there's men and women down there that are putting their lives on the line to get in the water and look for something that may or may not be there. If somebody gets hurt down there, one of these divers, this is all going to fall back on you. At that point, she kind of put her head down and said, no, it didn't happen. I was never pregnant. She was misleading her family and friends that she was in fact pregnant. That kind of takes it to another level. You then try your best to figure out how you're going to have the suspect explain what happened. So we took Sandy back up to the sheriff's office to continue the interview.
According to Sandy, Josie was discharged from the hospital the day after she gave birth.
So she went to go get her sister and a newborn baby at the hospital. She was supposed to go to her mother's house, and the baby and Josie were going to stay there.
They then went back to the Merrifield house and went in with the new baby.
After you arrived with Josie and the new baby, was Josie's other son, Jordan, also there?
Yes.
And after being there for a short time, did you, Josie, Jordan, and the new baby get into a vehicle and leave the area?
Yes.
Okay.
She wanted to take her to the gas station, and they'd be right back. Well, the gas station's right up the street. It's no more than like 5 minutes up the street.
Okay, you were driving, and then the children were in the back seat?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And while the two of you were driving, your conversation consisted of you were trying to explain to her that it would be a good idea for her to get a place of her own, and because of her children and due to the living conditions.
Yes, sir.
We learned that the Merrifield home had a lot going on, and that there was abuse in the home. And I think Sandy recognized that because Sandy could have been a victim of that. Sandy was able to remove herself from that home, and so she knew that what a newborn going back into that home, and or with the 2-year-old, that she didn't want them to be subjected to that. They were driving around having an argument. Sandy said she pulled the car off on the side of the road and was trying to compose herself. And then Josie got out of the car, and that's when Sandy told us that she blacked out. And when she came to, she had a rock in her hand, and Josie was laying in the water in the ditch.
I was too scared to even stand there and watch, so I looked. I left.
Okay, you got scared and left.
Yes.
Okay, and when you say you left, did you get back into that station wagon and leave, or did you leave on foot?
No, I got back into the station wagon and left.
Okay, and both children were still in that car, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
She told us that she went home and took the 2-year-old and the baby inside her home and waited for Everett to come home from work.
As we feel with the information that we get with Sandra, she's not totally credible on everything. And of course, there's Only 2 people know the truth. One of them's deceased.
Josie and Sandy's family members are stunned when they learn of Sandy's deception.
She had the belly bump and everything. We thought she was really pregnant. She had all the signs.
She had went to all these measures to make everyone believe that she was pregnant. I mean, she convinced Everett at one point that, oh, look, here, put your hand here, the baby's moving. And he said, oh, yeah, okay, I felt that. Everett was obviously very distraught over what was going on. He just couldn't believe that he was associated with somebody who would be involved in this.
She would tell Everett, I have to go to the doctor today. Same day, Josie would go to the doctor. Whatever Josie would say, she would say that's what the doctor told her, but she'd never been to the doctor. She was planning everything down to the T.
In an act that defies belief, Sandy Merrifield has confessed to killing her 18-year-old sister, Josie.
She said that in her state of mind, she was not there. She blacked out, so she doesn't remember too much.
So when she comes to, that's when she's standing there with a rock in her hand and seeing her sister there on the ground. Disassociation is a tool when something so difficult, so over the top, so stressful, so dangerous is happening that it's hard to bear, it's hard to be in that moment. Our body can use it to take us out of the situation. That can happen to especially a childhood trauma survivor.
While Sandy remains in custody, prosecutors begin piecing the evidence together.
In this case, one of those things you have to prove is that a person, although maybe they have some mental challenges, they are not to the level where they're not responsible for their own actions. The defense would want just the opposite result. They were so mentally ill that they didn't know what they were doing. So that's why there was a pre-sentence investigation done, which was really unremarkable because she didn't have any criminal history.
But the investigation does confirm abuse within the Merrifield household, suggesting where the trouble first began.
Growing up, I mean, there was good times and there was bad times. So the good times, I mean, when we had birthday parties and, you know, watch fireworks or stuff like that. I love that. You know, what kid wouldn't? But the rest of it, I try not to talk about it.
Detectives believe it was the idea of starting a family of her own that gave Sandy Merrifield hope for the future.
But Sandy had had 4 or 5 previous pregnancies that resulted in miscarriages. And I think she was, to a degree, she was a little bit jealous of Josie. Josie had a 2-year-old and then came home and told everybody that she was pregnant.
Apparently the family was all happy with Josie being pregnant. Sandra felt left out. She goes, guess what? I'm pregnant too. So now attention has changed from just Josie. Now it's on Sandra also.
I believe there was some excitement in the family because here were 2 sisters that were going to have a pregnancy together.
She starts this lie and continues this lie for 9 months, patting herself, several things.
She went and bought a little bitty bump pillow. So the bigger Josie got, the bigger pillow that she went and got.
But she didn't come up with an end game. That's the whole problem. What's the end game? Was she going to fake a miscarriage halfway through?
There was a conversation between Sandy and Josie about, look, just give me the baby, we'll raise it, and because you're not ready to take care of 2 children, Everett and I will take that baby and we'll do that. At some point, wherever it was, that Josie told Sandy, look, we're going to keep the baby. I think that just completely infuriated Sandy. Now, was there a level somewhere in Sandy that she did have some sort of a mental issue? She may have, but her mental issue allowed her for 9 months to orchestrate a pregnancy and convince people. And in my mind, that was premeditation.
I think she panicked in the last month of the pregnancy. Josie went in and had a baby, and now they're going to wait for me to have a baby, and I'm not going to have a baby. So what am I going to do?
Her envy, her hope, her desires to be a mom were so overwhelming. She could have had a moment of increased emotion, of uncomfortability in a dark car with her sister who just had the one thing she wanted.
I guess tragically was her only option in her mind. When the autopsy was done, I did show blunt force trauma to the head. She didn't bring a murder weapon with her. She used a weapon of opportunity, which was a rock and a brick at the seat.
There was never any mention of her trying to render any kind of aid, not going any place and making any phone calls for emergency services or anything like that. She just left her, got in the car, and drove away.
Josie's cause of death was drowning. So she was maybe likely unconscious when she was pushed or whatever into the water.
Sandy is charged with first-degree murder. As the case moves toward trial, prosecutors reach a difficult decision in 2001.
They made the determination to accept a second-degree murder plea and not go forward with first degree.
It goes back to her mental status. And you never know what's going to happen in front of a jury. And you never know what the jury is going to key in on and not key in on. So I think in this case, they got the sure thing. It was an 18-year sentence, but she got credit for 2 years that she had already served. At that time, based on the sentencing guidelines in Illinois, she only served about 7 years.
Honestly, I love my sister to death. I love all my sisters, don't get me wrong. But I think she should have got more time for doing it. I mean, why would you take your own sister's life? Why? I felt the hurt for her boys.
It is totally unfair. Jordan and Jasper, they didn't ask for any of this.
It's always just been me and my little brother since his day one. That's what I tell people. It's me and I'll tell him too. It's me and you. It's been me and you, and it's gonna be me and you. Like, I will always be there for family.
Losing my mom when I was 1 day old was a blessing and a curse. Because I was so young, I didn't have any memories with my mom. Never got to touch her, hug her, feel her, speak to her. It's a lot easier to lose someone when you don't have nothing to look back on. However, it's a curse because knowing that my mom was alive and well and would still be alive had it not been for Sandy doing what she did. If she didn't take the actions that she took that day, I feel like my life would be very different.
It's been 26 years since Sandy Merrifield took the life of her sister, Josie. Now, Josie's two sons are ready to be a part of the narrative.
So nobody knew who Jordan's dad was. So that was kind of like out of the picture anyway. But my dad was in the picture. However, he was married at the time that this happened, had a wife who was pregnant with twins and already had children that were born.
His wife found out about Jasper, and she gave Chester a ultimatum, pretty much, and he gave him up for adoption.
We were automatically placed in a home and adopted right out. Growing up, I would ask little questions here or there. I've been told, and our adopted mom would either just say, we'll talk about when you're older, or she'd give me just enough to stop me from asking questions.
I don't think that I found out about my real mom until maybe the age of I would say I was in the 4th or 5th grade. For the longest, I've wanted to know why. I've heard a lot of times that it was jealousy, that she wanted a baby and just couldn't have one. I would never kill a sibling over, what they have. I would never, I just could never do that. I don't know what she was going through or where her mindset was at.
I do know she's got kids of her own and she's got a family. And I'm thinking, yeah, she's out here, she's got a family, but she took mine away from me. She took that family away from me and my brother.
Why did she get to keep her kid and Josie didn't get to keep hers? Don't you think she would have loved to raise both of her boys? I would take Josie's place in a heartbeat. I would. No questions asked. I would let her be here with her boys.
An act like this, you just look at what it does to other lives, family members, and people who may have been just friends or close associates with the family.
A lot of my family has forgiven her. A lot of my family invites her over, talks to her, and it's hard to see that. It's almost as if they're choosing her over me in a way.
Me and my sister, I tolerate her right now, but I don't approve of what she did. And my pastor has told me, you have to forgive if you want to go to heaven. I can forgive her, but I can't forget whatever she did.
Would you ever want to talk to Sandy and just have one-on-one time with her?
If she would come out and actually explain why she did what she did, I would listen, because I would really like to know.
People who knew my mom tell me that I have my mom's spirit. And one of my friends or someone I know is struggling bad, I'm right there. What do you need? How can I help you do this or that? And the people who knew my mom best, they're like, that was Josie wholeheartedly.
From what I've heard, she was just a beautiful soul, an extraordinary person that, touched and changed a lot of lives in a short amount of time that she was here. She always sang and stuff like that. That's what I've been told, And then because I make music and I sing myself, I want to carry her with me. I do feel that my mom is with me all the time. Sometimes I I can feel her. Sometimes I think that I can hear her, you know. Who knows, like, what life could have been like if I had my mom here. I know that it would have been great.
I've been to my mom's grave. I stood there and I was like, Mama, I promise you, no matter what, I'm always gonna look out for you, my little brother. I'm gonna be there for him. You don't gotta worry about us, we'll be all right.
On a quiet autumn morning in Salt Lake City, nothing seemed unusual from the outside. The modest brick home stood exactly as it had the day before. Curtains covered the windows. The front yard was still. No shattered glass. No signs of panic. No cries for help. Just another peaceful neighborhood beginning another ordinary day. But behind one locked door waited a scene so horrifying that even veteran detectives would remember it for the rest of their careers. The woman inside had been brutally murdered. Her killer had vanished. And for nearly half a century, the truth would remain buried beneath fading memories, unanswered questions, and evidence that seemed impossible to unlock. This is the story of Sherry Black. A case that haunted investigators for 46 years. A mystery that refused to disappear. And a killer who believed time itself would erase every trace he had left behind. He was wrong. Long before her name appeared in police files and newspaper headlines, Sherry Black was simply a woman trying to build a life. Friends described her as warm, independent, and full of quiet determination. She had experienced the ordinary struggles that come with adulthood, relationships, work, family responsibilities, but those who knew her rarely imagined that her life would one day become the center of one of Utah's longest-running homicide investigations. The early 1970s were a different America. Neighborhoods still felt safe enough for unlocked doors. People trusted strangers more easily. DNA profiling did not exist. Fingerprints remained the king of forensic science, while countless crimes depended almost entirely on eyewitness testimony and detective instincts. If a murderer managed to avoid leaving obvious evidence, solving a homicide often became a race against time. And time usually favored the killer. On November 30, 1970, that race began. The morning unfolded like countless others. Until someone realized something was terribly wrong. Sherry Black was found dead inside her own home. The discovery instantly shattered any illusion of safety. Investigators entering the residence immediately recognized that this was no accident, no medical emergency, and no burglary gone wrong that had spiraled unexpectedly. The violence inside the house spoke for itself. The attack had been personal. Relentless. Savage. Every room seemed to preserve fragments of the final struggle. Furniture had been disturbed. Objects lay out of place. Investigators carefully photographed every corner, every surface, every item that might carry even the smallest clue. Back then, crime scene technicians worked with methods that today might seem painfully limited. There were no rapid DNA tests. No genetic genealogy. No digital crime scene reconstruction. Every fiber had to be collected by hand. Every fingerprint dusted manually. Every photograph developed in a laboratory. Every piece of evidence carefully labeled, boxed, and stored. Detectives knew they had only one chance to preserve the scene. Because once it was gone, it was gone forever. The medical examination painted an even darker picture. Sherry had fought desperately. She had not surrendered. She resisted with everything she had. The brutality suggested rage. Perhaps panic. Perhaps someone determined to eliminate the only witness to a terrible crime. Yet almost immediately, investigators encountered their first major obstacle. There appeared to be no obvious suspect. No neighbor reported hearing a violent confrontation. No one had seen a stranger fleeing the property. No nearby security cameras existed. In 1970, doorbell cameras belonged to science fiction. Most houses offered investigators nothing more than human memory. And human memory fades quickly. Detectives began the painstaking process of reconstructing Sherry's final days. Who had seen her last? Who knew her routine? Who might have wanted to hurt her? Friends were interviewed. Relatives were questioned. Co-workers were contacted. Every name went onto a growing list. Some interviews lasted minutes. Others stretched for hours. Every inconsistency became another thread worth pulling. Police examined her relationships. Former acquaintances. Neighbors. Anyone whose path had crossed hers recently. The investigation expanded rapidly, yet each new lead seemed to dissolve before reaching anything concrete. Rumors began spreading through the neighborhood. Some whispered about a jealous lover. Others believed an unknown drifter had wandered into the area. Still others suspected someone much closer to home. Fear travels faster than facts. Within days, the murder had become the only topic people wanted to discuss. Parents warned children not to walk alone. Doors that once remained unlocked throughout the day were suddenly secured. Outdoor lights stayed on longer at night. Every unfamiliar face became suspicious. The murder had changed more than one family. It had changed an entire community. Meanwhile, detectives searched for physical evidence capable of identifying the killer. Latent fingerprints were examined. Footwear impressions were documented. Trace evidence was collected wherever possible. The smallest fragment of material could become the breakthrough investigators desperately needed. At the laboratory, specialists worked through long hours comparing fingerprints against available records. Unlike modern automated databases, comparisons required enormous patience. Thousands upon thousands of cards had to be reviewed manually. The process could take weeks. Sometimes months. Sometimes years. And often, it produced absolutely nothing. Every negative result deepened the frustration. Every dead end strengthened the mystery. The homicide squad refused to give up. They believed someone knew something. Someone had seen something. Someone was keeping a dangerous secret. Detectives revisited witnesses again and again. Sometimes people remembered details differently after time had passed. A forgotten conversation. An unfamiliar vehicle. An unusual phone call. Even seemingly insignificant observations occasionally solved murders. But this case refused to cooperate. Each interview produced fragments. Never the complete picture. Each clue hinted at possibilities. Never certainty. As winter settled over Utah, newspapers continued covering the investigation. Headlines questioned whether a killer remained free. Editorials demanded justice. Citizens called police with anonymous tips. Some appeared promising. Others bordered on fantasy. Investigators chased them anyway. Because ignoring the wrong tip could mean overlooking the murderer. One caller claimed to have seen a suspicious man near the neighborhood days before the killing. Another insisted the crime involved organized criminals. Someone even suggested occult rituals. None survived scrutiny. Every theory collapsed beneath evidence, or the complete absence of it. Yet among experienced detectives, one belief quietly grew stronger. This had likely not been a random attack. the level of violence suggested familiarity. The killer seemed comfortable enough to enter the home. Perhaps Sherry knew him. Perhaps she trusted him. Or perhaps trust had been exploited. Investigators examined her personal life more closely. Every friendship. Every disagreement. Every former relationship. Every recent interaction. Names accumulated inside thick investigative folders. Some individuals willingly cooperated. Others became defensive. Several required repeated interviews. Still, suspicion alone could never support an arrest. Detectives needed evidence. Real evidence. And that remained painfully scarce. As weeks became months, pressure mounted inside the police department. The public wanted answers. The victims' loved ones wanted justice. City officials demanded progress. Every unsolved homicide carries invisible weight. The longer it remains unresolved, the heavier that burden becomes. Fresh cases arrive. New victims need attention. Resources become divided. Witnesses move away. Memories fade. Evidence deteriorates. Justice grows increasingly distant. Sherry Black's investigation slowly entered that dangerous territory. Not forgotten, but increasingly difficult. Boxes of reports multiplied. Crime scene photographs filled binders. Laboratory findings accumulated. Detectives reviewed timelines over and over. Sometimes late into the night. Sometimes hoping exhaustion would somehow reveal what clear thinking had missed. It never did. Occasionally, investigators believed they were close. A promising interview. An interesting forensic comparison. An unexpected statement. Each time, optimism briefly returned. Each time, disappointment followed. The murder remained unsolved. For Sherry's family, grief became something stranger than grief. It transformed into uncertainty. A funeral offers farewell. An arrest offers accountability. A conviction offers closure. But an unsolved murder suspends all three. Life continues. Birthdays arrive. Holidays return. Years pass. Yet one terrible question refuses to disappear. Who did this? That question echoed through every anniversary of the crime. Each November reopened wounds that had barely begun to heal. Police leadership changed. New detectives inherited the file. Veterans retired. Fresh investigators examined old evidence with new perspectives. Every generation believed perhaps they would finally uncover the missing piece. Every generation encountered the same silence. The case slowly earned a label investigators dread hearing. Cold case. Two simple words. Yet behind them lies extraordinary tragedy. Cold does not mean unimportant. Cold means every obvious path has already failed. Every major suspect has been examined. Every straightforward lead exhausted. The investigation survives not because answers exist, but because hope refuses to die. Inside evidence storage, sealed boxes waited patiently. Photographs. Clothing. Laboratory samples. Documents yellowing with age. Each item represented possibility frozen in time. No one could have imagined that among those carefully preserved exhibits rested evidence far more powerful than anyone in 1970 could understand. Science simply had not caught up. The killer could not know that. Neither could detectives. As America entered a new decade, technology advanced. Television changed. Cars changed. Society changed. Police work evolved alongside it. Yet one thing remained painfully unchanged. Sherry Black's murderer was still free. Perhaps building a new life. Perhaps raising a family. Perhaps reading newspaper stories about the investigation while believing he had escaped forever. History contains many criminals who survived not because they were brilliant, but because their era protected them. Before DNA. Before computerized databases. Before forensic breakthroughs transformed criminal investigations around the world. Some killers vanished into ordinary life. Neighbors greeted them. Co-workers trusted them. Friends laughed beside them. All while terrible secrets remained hidden beneath carefully constructed normality. Whether Sherry's killer lived that kind of double life remained unknown. But detectives increasingly suspected he had blended back into society. Because monsters rarely look like monsters. Sometimes they look completely ordinary. That realization haunted every investigator assigned to the case. Someone, somewhere, almost certainly knew the killer. Perhaps without realizing it. Perhaps living beside him. Perhaps sharing meals with him. Completely unaware that decades earlier, violence had erupted inside a quiet Salt Lake City home, leaving behind a crime scene that would become one of Utah's most enduring mysteries. The file continued growing thicker. The evidence remained locked away. The questions multiplied. And while calendars continued turning year after year, the silence surrounding Sherry Black's murder became almost as frightening as the crime itself, because with every passing season it seemed increasingly possible that the person responsible would never be identified, never be arrested, and never be forced to answer for the life that had been stolen behind the closed door of an ordinary house on an ordinary morning that forever changed everyone who stepped inside. 46 years of silence, the murder of Sherry Black finally solved. For decades, the murder of Sherry Black remained a wound that never fully closed. The passage of time did what time always does. It softened voices. It changed neighborhoods. It carried away witnesses. It erased small details that once seemed unforgettable. But one thing time could not erase was the question that had followed the case from the very beginning. Who killed Sherry Black? For investigators, the answer seemed trapped somewhere between the evidence collected in 1970 and the memories of those who were still alive to tell the story. The case had become a symbol of frustration. A reminder that even when detectives worked relentlessly, some crimes refused to surrender their secrets. But hidden inside the old files was something that would eventually transform the entire investigation. A piece of evidence collected decades earlier. Evidence that waited quietly while science caught up. In the years after Sherry Black's murder, the case moved through several stages of investigation. At first, there was urgency. Detectives were everywhere. Interviews happened constantly. Leads arrived every day. The community believed an arrest was coming soon. But as months passed, the pace changed. The phone stopped ringing. New information became rare. The flood of tips became a slow stream. And eventually, even that stream disappeared. The investigation entered the most difficult stage of any homicide case. The waiting period. The years when detectives must keep believing in a breakthrough that may never come. Cold cases are not forgotten overnight. They disappear slowly. A detective retires. A new officer takes over. Files move from one cabinet to another. Names become unfamiliar. Faces in photographs become strangers. But for the victim's family, the case never becomes old. The calendar may say 40 years have passed. The grief remains locked on the day everything changed. Sherry Black's loved ones carried that burden. They had to live with a reality that no family should ever face. Someone had murdered someone they loved. And somewhere beyond their sight, the person responsible continued living. Every anniversary brought the same painful reminder. The killer had escaped. But inside law enforcement, the case was never truly abandoned. The file remained. The evidence remained. And perhaps most importantly, the possibility remained. Because criminal investigations are not always solved by the newest clue. Sometimes they are solved by the oldest one. In the decades following Sherry's death, forensic science entered a revolution. The world of criminal investigations changed dramatically. In 1970, detectives searched for fingerprints, eyewitnesses, and physical objects. By the late 20th century, a new form of evidence had emerged. DNA. A microscopic biological signature unique to each person. A tool that could identify suspects with a level of precision investigators from earlier generations could barely imagine. At first, DNA testing was limited. The technology was expensive. The databases were small. Many older cases remained untouched because the science simply was not ready. But as years passed, laboratories became more advanced. Police departments across the country began reopening old investigations. Evidence that had once been considered exhausted was examined again. Cases that had gone silent for decades suddenly began producing answers. Victims who had waited years finally received justice. And detectives began asking an important question. Could the same thing happen for Sherry Black? Could the evidence collected in 1970 still speak? The answer depended on one critical factor: whether anything from the original crime scene had survived. Inside police evidence storage, old homicide files often contain forgotten treasures. A piece of clothing. A biological sample. A fingerprint lifted from an object. A trace of material invisible to investigators at the time. Every item carries a story. Every item represents a possibility. In Sherry Black's case, those possibilities remained sealed away. For years, investigators had looked at the evidence through the technology available to them. But modern forensic science offered a completely different perspective. The same evidence could now reveal information that had been impossible to detect decades earlier. A mystery that had defeated detectives in 1970 might not defeat science in the 21st century. This was the turning point for many cold cases. The past was no longer truly the past. Old crimes could return. Old evidence could awaken. And old killers could suddenly find themselves facing questions they thought had disappeared forever. However, solving a decades-old murder required more than technology. It required patience. It required careful review. And it required investigators willing to revisit painful details that many believed had already been exhausted. The Sherry Black case demanded exactly that. A new generation of detectives began examining the original investigation. They studied reports written by officers who were no longer on the force. They reviewed photographs taken before digital cameras existed. They analyzed interviews conducted when witnesses were younger and memories were clearer. Every page of the file represented a moment frozen in history. A moment when investigators were trying to understand a crime that had just happened. Now, decades later, detectives approached the same mystery with new tools. The questions changed. The possibilities expanded. Evidence once considered insignificant suddenly became important. This is one of the strangest realities of cold cases. Sometimes the answer was always there. It was simply waiting for the right moment to be discovered. As investigators dug deeper, attention returned to the original crime scene. The location where Sherry Black spent her final moments. The place where the killer had left behind the evidence that would eventually expose him. Forensic specialists understand something that criminals often fail to recognize. A crime scene remembers. Human beings may forget. Witnesses may move away. Stories may change. But physical evidence remains silent and patient. A fingerprint does not forget. A DNA profile does not age the same way memory does. A tiny biological trace can survive longer than an entire lifetime. That possibility changed everything. For 46 years, the killer had lived with one belief: that the passage of time had protected him. That the investigation had ended. That the evidence had become meaningless. But time was not always an ally for criminals. Sometimes time was the reason they were eventually caught. The world around the case had changed dramatically. The technology that investigators in 1970 could only dream about now existed. And with every advancement in forensic science, the possibility of answers became stronger. Yet even with new technology, investigators faced another challenge: finding a suspect. DNA could identify a person. But only if that person's profile existed somewhere. A match required a connection. A name. A trail. And after 46 years, that trail was buried beneath decades of history. People had moved. Families had changed. Lives had been rebuilt. The person responsible could have been anywhere. The investigation had to bridge an enormous gap between the past and the present. The crime scene from 1970. The world of modern forensic science. The young woman whose life ended too soon. And the unknown individual who had carried the secret for decades. As detectives continued their review, they faced a question that had challenged cold case investigators everywhere. What if the person they were searching for was no longer the same person who committed the crime? Age changes people. Time changes circumstances. A suspect from 1970 could now be elderly. A once young man could now be approaching the final years of his life. But none of that changed the central truth. A victim had been denied justice. A family had waited decades for answers. And somewhere in the evidence was a message from the past. The investigation was no longer moving forward through traditional detective work. It was moving backward. Into old reports. Old photographs. Old memories. And old secrets. The world had forgotten many details about the night Sherry Black was killed. But the evidence had not forgotten. The question was whether it would finally reveal what happened inside that home. For 46 years, the answer had remained hidden. Now, for the first time, investigators had a chance to uncover the truth. And somewhere beyond the walls of the police department, someone who had spent decades believing he had escaped was about to discover that the past was not finished with him yet. For 46 years, the name Sherry Black remained attached to a question that refused to disappear. A young woman had been murdered inside her own home. A community had been shaken. A family had been forced to live with unanswered grief. And the person responsible had remained hidden in plain sight. But by the time investigators reopened the case with modern forensic tools, they were no longer chasing a fresh trail. They were chasing a ghost. The streets had changed. The neighborhood had changed. the people connected to the investigation had grown older or passed away. The world where the crime happened existed only in photographs and memories. Yet the evidence collected in 1970 remained a bridge between two different eras. One where the murder seemed impossible to solve, and another where science had begun rewriting the rules of justice. The renewed investigation required detectives to look at the case differently. The original investigators had worked with the technology available to them. They followed leads based on human behavior. They searched for motives. They questioned people who knew Sherry. They tried to understand why someone would target her. But decades later, investigators could approach the case from another direction. Instead of asking only, who would commit this crime? They could ask a different question. Whose biological evidence was left behind? That question changed everything. Cold case investigations often begin with a simple act. A detective opens an old file. Inside are pages filled with names, handwritten notes, photographs, and reports created by people who believed the case would be solved quickly. But decades later, those same documents tell a different story. They reveal how much investigators knew, and how much they could never have known. The Sherry Black file represented an entire generation of police work. A time before modern forensic databases. A time before investigators could compare unknown DNA samples against millions of profiles. A time when a killer could leave behind evidence and still remain invisible. But technology had transformed the battlefield. And now, the evidence itself became the focus. Investigators carefully reviewed everything connected to the crime scene. Every item collected decades earlier had to be reconsidered. Was there biological material? Could it still be tested? Had it been preserved properly? Could modern science extract information that earlier generations could never obtain? These questions were not theoretical. Across the United States, old murder cases were suddenly coming back to life. Criminals who had lived quietly for decades were being identified through DNA. Some were discovered through direct database matches. Others through advanced genetic techniques that connected relatives and uncovered hidden family histories. The past was becoming searchable. And criminals who believed they had escaped forever were finding out that time was no longer protecting them. For Sherry Black's case, the breakthrough would depend on the same principle. A tiny piece of evidence. A connection between the crime scene and a living person. A link across 46 years. But before investigators could reach an answer, they had to reconstruct the mystery once again. They returned to the beginning. To the day Sherry Black was found. To the scene that had haunted detectives for decades. To the unanswered questions surrounding her final moments. One of the biggest challenges in any cold case is separating fact from memory. Over time, stories change. People unintentionally alter details. Events that once seemed clear become uncertain. A witness may remember a conversation differently after 20 years. A person who was questioned in 1970 may no longer remember exactly what they said. Human memory is fragile. Evidence is different. Evidence does not become emotional. It does not forget. It does not exaggerate. That is why investigators placed renewed focus on physical clues. The crime scene became the center of the investigation again. The same location that had once represented failure now represented possibility. Because somewhere inside that house, the killer had left a piece of himself behind. The question was whether that piece had survived. As investigators worked through the old evidence, they also examined the original list of people connected to the case. Names that had appeared decades earlier. Individuals who had been questioned. people who had once been considered possible suspects. The challenge was enormous. Many people connected to the investigation were no longer alive. Others had moved away. Some had completely disappeared from the radar. Tracking a person across 46 years is not like following a fresh lead. It requires rebuilding an entire history. Where did they go? Who did they become? Did they remain in the area? Did they leave behind records? Did they have connections that investigators had never discovered? Every question created another path. Some led nowhere. Others slowly moved the investigation forward. But the most important breakthrough came not from a witness. Not from a confession. Not from a dramatic discovery in an old notebook. It came from science. The evidence collected decades earlier was submitted for modern forensic analysis. And slowly, the past began to speak. DNA testing is remarkable because it transforms invisible material into a powerful identifier. A microscopic biological trace can contain a genetic profile unique to one individual. Unlike fingerprints, which require a person to touch a surface in a certain way, DNA can be transferred through ordinary contact. Skin cells, blood, other biological material. Tiny traces that criminals often never realize they leave behind. In 1970, investigators could not fully use that information. But decades later, the technology had changed. The same evidence that once sat quietly inside storage now had the potential to reveal a name. The possibility was both exciting and dangerous. Because solving a cold case after decades requires investigators to be certain. A mistake could destroy the credibility of an entire investigation. A wrong accusation could harm innocent people. Every result had to be carefully examined. Every connection had to be verified. The investigators were not simply searching for someone. They were searching for the truth. And the truth had to survive scrutiny. As testing continued, the case moved closer to a turning point. The silence that had surrounded Sherry Black's murder for nearly half a century began to weaken. The person responsible had spent decades believing the past was buried. But the past was beginning to open. The investigation had reached a moment that every cold case detective hopes for. A moment when possibility becomes reality. A moment when the impossible begins to look possible. But identifying evidence is only the first step. A name does not automatically explain a crime. It does not answer every question. It does not erase decades of uncertainty. Investigators still needed to understand who this person was. Where they had been. How they were connected to Sherry Black. And what happened on that terrible day in 1970. Because after 46 years of waiting, the case was no longer just about finding a suspect. It was about uncovering the truth hidden beneath decades of silence. The investigation had entered a new chapter. The evidence had produced a direction. A path that detectives could finally follow. And at the end of that path was the person who had escaped justice for almost half a century. A person whose name had remained unknown for generations. A person who had carried a secret through an entire lifetime. But now, that secret was beginning to surface. And the question that had haunted investigators since 1970 was finally approaching an answer. Who killed Sherry Black? After 46 years, the world was about to find out. For decades, the murder of Sherry Black existed in a painful space between memory and mystery. A case without closure. A crime without accountability. A family forced to carry a question that had no answer. But now, after 46 years of silence, investigators were no longer searching blindly. The evidence had begun pointing toward a name. A person. A possible connection between the violent act inside a Salt Lake City home and someone who had managed to remain outside the reach of justice for nearly half a century. The breakthrough did not come from a dramatic confession. There was no sudden phone call from a guilty conscience. No hidden diary. No stranger walking into a police station ready to admit the truth. Instead, it came from the quiet power of science. A science that did not exist when Sherry Black was murdered. A science that had transformed the way detectives solved the oldest and most difficult crimes. DNA had changed everything. But DNA alone was only the beginning. Because behind every genetic profile is a human story. And investigators now had to uncover that story. They had to determine how a person connected to the crime had lived for 46 years without being identified. They had to understand who this individual was before the crime, after the crime, and during all the years when Sherry Black's name remained in the headlines. Cold cases are often described as puzzles. But they are not ordinary puzzles. They are puzzles where many pieces have disappeared. Where some pieces belong to people who are no longer alive. Where the image can only be completed by combining technology, patience, and human determination. The investigators working on Sherry Black's case understood that finding a genetic connection was a historic moment. But they also understood the responsibility that came with it. Every piece of information had to be confirmed. Every possibility had to be tested. A 46-year-old mystery could not be solved through assumptions. It required proof. The investigation moved carefully. Detectives began examining the individual connected to the DNA evidence. The name represented more than just a suspect. It represented decades of unanswered questions. Who was this person? Where had he been? What had he done after 1970? Had anyone around him suspected anything? Had he carried the secret silently while building an ordinary life? These questions became central. Because one of the most unsettling realities of many cold cases is that killers do not always live like criminals. They often disappear into normal life. They go to work. They form relationships. They grow older. They become part of communities that may never know what they have done. The person investigators were now examining had lived through an entire lifetime after Sherry Black's death. 46 years of birthdays. 46 years of ordinary days. 46 years where the world moved forward while one family remained trapped in the past. But the past had finally caught up. Investigators began reconstructing the suspect's history. Every available record mattered. Employment. Residences. Relationships. Personal connections. Any detail that could explain how this individual crossed paths with Sherry Black in 1970. The challenge was enormous because time had created distance. The investigation had to travel backward. From the present to the past. From an older individual to the person he had been decades earlier. From a modern suspect profile to a young man living in the world of 1970. This process required investigators to ask difficult questions. Where was he on the day Sherry died? Did anyone remember him? Was he connected to the neighborhood? Did he have a reason to be near her home? Could witnesses from decades earlier provide information? Some answers came quickly. Others remained buried. But the direction of the investigation had changed forever. For the first time, detectives were not searching for an unknown killer. They were investigating a specific person. That difference cannot be overstated. For decades, the murderer existed only as a shadow. A possibility. A faceless figure. Now, investigators had something they had never possessed before. A starting point. Meanwhile, the impact of the breakthrough reached far beyond the police department. For Sherry Black's family, the news represented something almost impossible to describe. For years, they had lived with uncertainty. They had wondered whether justice would ever come. They had wondered whether the person responsible would ever be identified. Many families of cold case victims know this feeling. They do not simply lose someone. They lose the ability to understand what happened. There is no final chapter. No explanation. No accountability. Only questions. But now, after nearly 5 decades, the possibility of answers had returned. The case that had once seemed frozen in time was moving again. The community that had lived with the mystery for generations was finally hearing a different kind of headline. Not another reminder of failure. Not another anniversary of an unsolved murder. But a sign that justice was still possible. However, investigators knew the hardest part was not over. Finding a suspect was one challenge. Proving the case was another. A murder investigation cannot be solved by emotion. It cannot be solved simply because someone appears suspicious. The evidence must connect the person to the crime. The timeline must make sense. The facts must survive courtroom examination. Every cold case that reaches this stage faces a final test. Can decades-old evidence still tell a complete story? The prosecution would need more than DNA. They would need context. They would need to explain the connection between the suspect and Sherry Black. They would need to show how the evidence fit together. Piece by piece. Fact by fact. Because after 46 years, the investigation had finally reached the point where a person could be held responsible. But justice delayed is complicated. Time changes everything. Witnesses age. Evidence becomes fragile. Memories become uncertain. The world in which the crime happened no longer exists exactly as it once did. Yet the search for truth continued. Investigators returned again to the details of November 1970. They looked at the crime scene. They looked at Sherry's final moments. They looked at the decisions made by the killer. Every action leaves a pattern. Every mistake creates a weakness. And after decades of silence, investigators believed the killer's greatest mistake had finally been discovered. He had left something behind. Something invisible. Something he never believed could identify him. The technology of the future had reached back into the past. And now, the investigation was no longer about whether Sherry Black's murderer would ever be found. The question had changed. It was no longer, who could have done this? It became, how did he live with what he had done for 46 years? As investigators prepared to reveal the truth behind one of Utah's longest-running mysteries, the story of Sherry Black entered its most important moment. A case that began with a silent home, a devastated family, and a killer disappearing into the night, was now approaching the moment everyone had waited for. The moment when a name would finally be attached to the crime. The moment when the voice of the victim, silent for decades, would finally be heard again. And after 46 years of unanswered questions, the world was about to learn the identity of the person who had taken Sherry Black's life and walked away believing he had escaped forever. For nearly half a century, the murder of Sherry Black existed as an open wound. A file that refused to close. A question that refused to fade. A name that remained written on a list of victims whose families were still waiting for justice. But now, after decades of silence, investigators had reached the moment that every cold case detective dreams of. They had a suspect. The shadow that had followed the case since 1970 finally had a face. The person who had remained hidden behind the passage of time was no longer just an unknown figure. He was someone who had lived among others. Someone who had grown older. Someone who had carried the weight of a secret that investigators believed was about to be exposed. The investigation moved forward carefully. Because 46 years can change almost everything. A young person becomes elderly. A neighborhood transforms. Witnesses disappear. Memories become incomplete. But one thing remains unchanged. The truth of what happened. The evidence collected inside Sherry Black's home had created the connection investigators needed. The science had opened the door. Now detectives had to walk through it. The process of identifying the person responsible was not simple. A DNA result can provide a name, but a name alone does not tell the entire story. Investigators needed to understand the relationship between the suspect and the crime. They needed to answer the questions that had remained unanswered since that tragic day. Why Sherry? Why her home? Why that moment? And why had the killer believed he could escape forever? Those questions guided the next stage of the investigation. Detectives began reconstructing the suspect's past. They examined his background. They studied his movements. They searched for connections that might explain how he became linked to one of Utah's most haunting crimes. The investigation became a journey through time. A journey from the present back to 1970. Every year between those 2 points mattered. Every decision. Every location. Every relationship. Because a person does not simply appear in a cold case after 46 years. There is always a history. There is always a trail. The challenge is finding it. Investigators also had to consider the possibility that the person they were now examining had changed dramatically over the decades. People evolve. Lives take unexpected directions. Someone who commits a terrible act in youth may later appear completely ordinary. That reality makes cold cases especially disturbing. The passage of time can hide the person, but it cannot erase the crime. For Sherry Black's family, the possibility of an arrest brought emotions that were difficult to describe. After so many years, hope and pain existed together. Justice was finally approaching. But nothing could return what had been taken away. No arrest could erase the loss. No conviction could restore the years stolen by grief. The goal was not to undo the past. It was to finally acknowledge it. To recognize that Sherry Black's life mattered. That her death mattered. That her story had never been forgotten. As investigators prepared their case, they also reviewed the original crime scene once more. Cold case detectives often describe old evidence as a conversation with the past. The people involved are gone. The voices have disappeared. But the objects remain. The photographs. The reports. The physical evidence. All of them preserve moments that would otherwise be lost forever. Inside those records was the final chapter of Sherry Black's life. And now, investigators believed they understood the path that led to her death. The case had taken nearly 5 decades to reach this point. But the final steps required precision. Every detail mattered. Every piece had to fit. A single mistake could create doubt. And doubt was something investigators could not afford. The suspect had lived for decades outside the spotlight. The investigation had to bring the truth into the light with undeniable clarity. Meanwhile, the public reaction grew stronger. For years, many people had known Sherry Black's name only as part of an unsolved murder. A mystery from another era. A story that appeared in newspapers and then slowly disappeared. But the possibility of a resolution brought the case back into public attention. People who had once wondered whether the killer would ever be found now watched as the investigation reached its final stage. The story represented something larger than one crime. It represented the power of persistence. The idea that victims of unsolved cases are not forgotten. That evidence can wait. That justice can take years, even decades, but still arrive. The investigators working on the case understood the importance of every decision. They were not only solving a homicide. They were carrying the responsibility of a family that had waited 46 years. They were answering a question that had haunted an entire community. And they were giving a voice back to someone who had been silent for too long. But before the final resolution could come, investigators still had to confront one of the most difficult parts of any cold case. The suspect's story. Every accused person has a history. Every investigation must examine not only what evidence suggests, but what actually happened. Detectives needed to determine how the pieces connected. How the suspect fit into the timeline. How the evidence from 1970 matched the scientific discoveries made decades later. The investigation was no longer about searching. It was about proving. And proof requires patience. The years of uncertainty had created enormous expectations. The public wanted answers. The family wanted closure. Investigators wanted justice. But the truth could not be rushed. The case had survived for 46 years because investigators refused to let it disappear. Now they had to ensure the final chapter was built on facts. As detectives continued preparing, one haunting reality remained. The person responsible had lived with the knowledge of what happened. For decades, every ordinary day after the murder represented another unanswered question. Every morning. Every conversation. Every moment of normal life. All while a family continued waiting. That contrast is one of the most painful elements of long unsolved crimes. For victims' families, time stops at the moment of tragedy. For everyone else, life continues. But now, the two timelines were finally meeting. The day Sherry Black was killed. And the day justice came searching for the person responsible. 46 years of silence were beginning to break. The investigation that had once seemed impossible was moving toward a conclusion. The evidence had spoken. The past had returned. And the man who believed the years would protect him was about to discover the one thing he never expected. Time had not erased the crime. Time had preserved the evidence. And after almost half a century, the truth was finally ready to emerge. 46 years is long enough for an entire generation to disappear. Children become grandparents. Police officers retire. Neighborhoods change their names. Businesses open and close. Entire city blocks evolve beyond recognition. Yet for the family of a murder victim, time has a cruel way of standing still. Every calendar page that turns only adds another year to the wait. Another birthday without answers. Another holiday marked by an empty chair. Another reminder that somewhere, someone had taken a life and never paid the price. For the investigators now assigned to the Sherry Black case, that reality became impossible to ignore. This was no longer just another cold case sitting on a shelf. It had become a promise. A promise made decades earlier by detectives who had refused to give up, even when every lead disappeared. Those investigators had preserved evidence with extraordinary care, believing that one day someone else might possess the tools they lacked. Now that day had arrived. Modern forensic testing had pointed investigators toward a specific individual. The question was no longer whether the science worked. The question was whether the evidence, when combined with the historical record, would establish responsibility beyond reasonable doubt. Cold case prosecutions demand something extraordinary. Unlike fresh investigations, there is no opportunity to revisit the original crime scene. The house has changed. The environment is gone. The immediate observations belong only to photographs, sketches, and reports prepared decades earlier. Everything depends on how carefully the original investigators documented their work. In Sherry Black's case, those records became invaluable. Every photograph was examined again. Every handwritten note was reviewed. Every interview transcript was compared against newly developed information. Investigators searched for details that earlier detectives might not have recognized as important. Not because those officers had failed, but because science had changed the meaning of the evidence. A biological trace that seemed insignificant in 1970 could become the centerpiece of an investigation decades later. The same was true for timelines. The original detectives had reconstructed Sherry's final known movements using the information available at the time. Now investigators revisited those timelines with renewed focus. Every hour mattered. Every confirmed sighting. Every documented interaction. Every statement preserved inside the case file. The goal was simple. Place the suspect within the historical picture as accurately as possible. At the same time, detectives investigated the suspect's life after 1970. Not to judge who he had become, but to understand whether any part of that history explained what happened before. Had he remained in Utah? Had he maintained connections to people who knew Sherry? Had he ever attracted the attention of law enforcement for other reasons? These questions formed part of the broader investigative picture. A homicide case is never built upon a single fact. It is built upon a collection of facts that reinforce one another until the overall picture becomes clear. Meanwhile, prosecutors began working closely with detectives. Every cold case homicide that reaches the possibility of criminal charges faces unique legal challenges. Witnesses may no longer be available. Some evidence may have deteriorated. Others involved in the original investigation may have passed away. The prosecution must explain not only the crime itself but also why the case remained unresolved for so many years. In this investigation, the answer was straightforward. The technology capable of identifying the suspect simply did not exist in 1970. That reality has transformed criminal justice across the world. Cases once considered unsolvable have returned to life because science has advanced faster than criminals anticipated. Many offenders committed crimes believing that if they escaped the initial investigation, they would remain safe forever. DNA changed that calculation. A murderer could hide from detectives. He could move across states. He could build a new identity. He could remain silent. But if biological evidence survived, time itself could become the investigator's greatest ally. That truth echoed throughout the Sherry Black investigation. The evidence had waited. Patiently. Silently. Unchanged. As investigators prepared for the next stage, they also considered something beyond the courtroom. The emotional impact. For the family, identifying a suspect did not erase decades of pain. Instead, it reopened memories that had never truly healed. Old newspaper clippings resurfaced. Photographs of Sherry returned to public attention. People who had known her decades earlier began sharing memories once again. She was remembered not merely as a victim, but as a daughter, a friend, and a woman whose future had been stolen. That distinction mattered. Cold cases often risk reducing victims to evidence files. Investigators understood that solving the case meant restoring Sherry's identity beyond the crime. She had lived a life before becoming a headline. She had dreams before becoming a mystery. And after 46 years, those closest to her deserved to see her remembered for more than the violence that ended her life. The renewed investigation also attracted public attention throughout Utah. Many residents who had not even been born in 1970 learned about the case for the first time. They discovered that one of the state's oldest unsolved murders had suddenly become active again. The story resonated because it challenged a common belief: that enough time can bury the truth. Instead, the Sherry Black investigation demonstrated the opposite. Time can preserve the opportunity for justice. Every advancement in forensic science gives investigators another chance. Another possibility. Another reason to reopen forgotten files. As preparations continued, detectives remained cautious. Public attention can create enormous pressure. But pressure cannot replace evidence. Investigators refused to overstate their conclusions. Every finding required confirmation. Every conclusion required support. This careful approach reflected decades of experience. They understood that solving a murder after 46 years demanded not only confidence but absolute precision. Behind closed doors, the case continued moving steadily forward. The evidence was organized. Expert opinions were prepared. Historical records were assembled. The investigation had evolved into something far more comprehensive than the original detectives could ever have imagined. It now combined traditional police work with modern forensic science. 2 generations of investigators working together across nearly half a century. 1 generation preserving the evidence. Another unlocking its meaning. Few cases illustrate that partnership more clearly. The detectives who first entered Sherry Black's home in November 1970 could never have predicted DNA technology. Yet their decision to carefully collect and preserve physical evidence became the foundation upon which the future investigation was built. Without that work, there would have been no second chance. No renewed inquiry. No path toward identifying the person responsible. In many ways, the investigation became a tribute not only to perseverance but also to professionalism. Justice sometimes depends upon people preparing for a future they will never see. That is exactly what happened here. As prosecutors and investigators reviewed every aspect of the case one final time, a remarkable truth became impossible to ignore. The killer had escaped immediate justice. But he had never escaped the evidence. For 46 years, he unknowingly remained connected to the crime through biological traces left behind inside Sherry Black's home. Invisible. Silent. Waiting. What once appeared insignificant had become decisive. The past had preserved its own witness. And unlike human memory, that witness had never forgotten. Now, after decades of uncertainty, the investigation stood at the threshold of accountability. A name had emerged. The evidence had endured. The family was closer than ever to answers. And the case that had once symbolized frustration was about to become one of Utah's clearest demonstrations that even after nearly half a century, justice could still find the person who believed history had left him behind. 46 years of silence, the murder of Sherry Black finally solved. The announcement that Douglas Lovell had been identified as the man responsible for Sherry Black's murder marked the end of one mystery. It also marked the beginning of another. Finding a name after 46 years was extraordinary. Proving that name in a court of law would require something even greater. For investigators, the celebration was brief. They understood that identifying a suspect through forensic evidence was only one stage in the pursuit of justice. The criminal justice system demands more than certainty. It demands proof presented openly, carefully, and lawfully. Every conclusion reached during the renewed investigation would now face the scrutiny of the courtroom. Every report, every forensic finding, every decision made by detectives, everything had to withstand examination. The years that separated the murder from the prosecution made the challenge unique. This was not a fresh homicide. The crime scene no longer existed as it had in 1970. Many of the original investigators had retired. Some witnesses were no longer alive. Others had little memory of events that had taken place nearly half a century earlier. Yet despite those obstacles, one advantage remained stronger than ever. The physical evidence had survived. Unlike memory, evidence does not become less truthful with age. If preserved correctly, it continues telling the same story. The prosecution's task was to demonstrate exactly that. Inside the courtroom, the murder of Sherry Black was no longer simply an old newspaper headline. It became a living case once again. Jurors were introduced to events that had taken place decades before many of them were even born. Photographs preserved since 1970. Crime scene documentation. Forensic reports. Scientific testimony explaining how advances in DNA technology had transformed evidence once considered impossible to interpret. The case represented two different eras of criminal investigation. One built on traditional detective work. The other built on modern forensic science. Together, they formed a single narrative. A narrative stretching across 46 years. For prosecutors, clarity was essential. The passage of time could not be allowed to create confusion. The jury needed to understand not only what happened inside Sherry Black's home but also why justice had taken so long to arrive. The answer was straightforward. Investigators in 1970 had preserved evidence carefully. Technology simply had not yet reached the point where that evidence could identify the person who left it behind. Decades later, scientific progress completed what earlier investigators had begun. This explanation became one of the defining features of the case. It demonstrated that the delay had not resulted from indifference. It resulted from the limits of forensic science at the time. As experts explained DNA analysis, the courtroom witnessed something remarkable. Evidence collected in an era without genetic profiling had become one of the strongest forms of identification available. The microscopic traces recovered decades earlier now connected the past to the present with extraordinary precision. For the family, every day inside the courtroom carried enormous emotional weight. 46 years earlier, they had buried someone they loved. Now they were hearing details of the investigation that had remained hidden for generations. Each piece of testimony represented another step toward understanding. Another step toward accountability. But justice after so many years is never simple. It cannot erase the decades already lost. It cannot restore birthdays missed. It cannot return conversations that never happened. The legal process could only address one question. Who was responsible? The answer emerging from the evidence was clear. Douglas Lovell. As the proceedings continued, investigators reflected on the extraordinary journey of the case. Many of those who first responded to the murder scene had believed the investigation would conclude within weeks or months. Instead, it became part of Utah's criminal history. Generations of detectives inherited the file. Each added new notes. Each reviewed old evidence. Each hoped to discover what the previous generation had missed. None abandoned the case. That continuity became one of the investigation's greatest strengths. Justice often depends not on one detective but on many, each contributing a small part, each preserving the work for those who come later. The Sherry Black investigation became a powerful example of that principle. No single person solved the case. The original detectives preserved the evidence. Forensic specialists protected it. Laboratory scientists developed new methods. Cold case investigators reopened the file. Prosecutors assembled the final presentation. Justice emerged through the combined efforts of countless individuals separated by decades. Outside the courtroom, the case attracted widespread attention. Media organizations revisited the story. They described not only the murder but also the remarkable forensic journey that finally identified the killer. For many viewers and readers, the investigation symbolized hope. Hope that other families still waiting for answers might one day receive them. Hope that evidence preserved today could solve crimes tomorrow. Hope that even the oldest mysteries need not remain mysteries forever. The case also became a lesson in patience. Modern audiences often expect immediate answers. Television dramas solve murders within an hour. Real investigations are different. Some require weeks. Others require months. And some require nearly half a century. The murder of Sherry Black belonged to that final category. It reminded everyone involved that justice follows no predictable timetable. Sometimes the truth waits. Sometimes science must catch up. Sometimes evidence remains silent until someone finally learns how to listen. As the legal proceedings moved toward their conclusion, another realization emerged. The investigation had achieved something beyond a criminal prosecution. It had restored Sherry Black's voice. For decades, her story had been overshadowed by one phrase: unsolved. Now that label no longer defined the case. Her name was no longer attached solely to mystery. It became attached to perseverance, to determination, to the refusal of investigators and loved ones to allow the case to disappear into history. For Douglas Lovell, the passage of 46 years had not erased responsibility. Instead, those years had become the very reason he was eventually identified. The evidence survived because careful investigators believed the future might one day reveal what the present could not. That belief proved correct. The courtroom represented the final meeting place between two moments separated by nearly half a century. November 1970. And the modern pursuit of justice. The distance between those moments seemed impossible. Yet every preserved report, every carefully stored exhibit, every advancement in forensic science, had quietly built a bridge across those decades. Now that bridge had carried the investigation to its destination. The identity of the killer was no longer hidden. The truth had emerged from silence. And after 46 years, the woman whose murder had once seemed destined to remain one of Utah's greatest unsolved mysteries was finally at the center of a case that demonstrated one enduring truth. Time may delay justice, but it does not always defeat it. When a murder remains unsolved for 46 years, people begin to believe that justice has an expiration date. They assume evidence fades beyond use. They assume memories disappear beyond recovery. They assume the person responsible has simply won. The murder of Sherry Black shattered that belief. Not because time had been kind to the investigation, but because the investigation had refused to surrender to time. By the time the legal process reached its final stages, the case had become far more than the story of a single homicide. It had become a testament to persistence. A demonstration that careful police work can outlive the detectives who first performed it. A reminder that science continues moving forward, even while old evidence waits patiently inside sealed containers. For the prosecution, every element of the case had to reinforce one central truth. Douglas Lovell was not identified because of speculation. He was not identified because someone suddenly remembered a forgotten conversation. He was identified because preserved evidence, examined with modern forensic technology, established a connection that investigators in 1970 had been incapable of proving. That distinction mattered enormously. Cold cases demand extraordinary confidence in the evidence. Jurors must trust that the passage of decades has not weakened the truth. The prosecution therefore relied heavily on documented facts. Original crime scene records. Preserved exhibits. Scientific analysis. Historical investigative reports. Each component supported the others. Together, they formed a picture that had remained incomplete for nearly half a century. The defense, as expected in any criminal proceeding, challenged aspects of the prosecution's presentation. Questions were raised about the age of the evidence, about the extraordinary passage of time, about whether events from so many years earlier could still be reconstructed accurately. Those questions reflected the reality of every long-delayed prosecution. Justice delayed inevitably creates legal complexity. But complexity does not erase evidence. It simply requires greater care in explaining it. Expert witnesses became especially important. Forensic specialists explained how biological evidence can remain suitable for analysis when properly preserved. They described the scientific methods used to generate reliable DNA profiles. They explained the rigorous standards laboratories must follow to prevent contamination or error. The science itself became part of the story. Not dramatic. Not emotional. But methodical. Objective. Precise. Exactly the qualities investigators needed after 46 years. Meanwhile, the emotional center of the case remained unchanged. Sherry Black. Throughout the proceedings, prosecutors consistently returned attention to the victim. Behind every forensic report stood a human life. A young woman whose future had ended violently inside her own home. A family forced to endure decades without answers. A community that had lived alongside one of Utah's oldest unresolved murders. The courtroom reminded everyone that this was never simply about scientific advancement. It was about accountability. It was about restoring justice to someone whose voice had been silenced. Outside the courthouse, reactions reflected the extraordinary nature of the case. Former detectives expressed admiration for the investigators who carried the file forward. Forensic experts pointed to the investigation as an example of why evidence preservation is so critical. Families of victims in other unsolved cases watched closely, hoping their own stories might one day follow a similar path. The ripple effect extended far beyond Utah. Across the country, law enforcement agencies reviewed aging homicide files with renewed optimism. If Sherry Black's murder could be solved after 46 years, perhaps other forgotten cases still held untapped answers. Perhaps evidence sitting quietly inside storage rooms contained secrets waiting for modern science to reveal. The investigation inspired renewed commitment to cold case work. It demonstrated that patience is not passive. Patience is preparation. Every carefully preserved exhibit represents faith in future discovery. Every documented report preserves an opportunity for investigators yet to come. One of the most striking aspects of the Sherry Black case was how different generations of professionals contributed to the outcome. The detectives who first entered the home in 1970 never knew DNA technology would revolutionize criminal investigations. Yet they preserved evidence meticulously. Laboratory personnel safeguarded that evidence for decades. Cold case investigators reopened the file with fresh determination. Scientists applied methods unavailable to earlier generations. Prosecutors assembled the final case. Justice emerged because each generation completed its own part of the mission. No single breakthrough solved the murder. Persistence did. As the proceedings drew toward their conclusion, another powerful message became increasingly clear. The killer had not escaped because he was invisible. He had escaped because science had not yet reached him. There is an important difference. Invisible people remain hidden forever. Science continues advancing. Every year introduces new investigative techniques, new laboratory methods, new analytical tools. The passage of time no longer guarantees safety for offenders who leave behind physical evidence. Instead, every passing decade increases the possibility that old crimes will finally reveal their secrets. That lesson resonated deeply within law enforcement. Evidence once considered exhausted is now frequently re-examined. Old homicide files once destined for permanent storage are reopened. Families once told there were no further investigative options now receive unexpected phone calls. Sometimes those calls change everything. For the Black family, the case had become part of everyday life. Not because they wanted it to, but because unresolved grief has a way of becoming permanent. Questions repeated themselves year after year. Who? Why? Would anyone ever be held responsible? The investigation finally answered the first question. The second remained more difficult. Motives often disappear with time. Human decisions remain complicated even when criminal responsibility becomes clear. Yet accountability itself carries enormous meaning. Justice cannot erase suffering. It can recognize it. It can acknowledge that a wrong occurred. It can affirm that the victim's life mattered. As reporters summarized the extraordinary history of the investigation, one theme appeared repeatedly. Persistence. 46 years of persistence. Not uninterrupted activity. Not constant headlines. But continuous commitment. The case was never abandoned. It simply waited for the future. That future finally arrived through science. For Douglas Lovell, the years that once appeared to provide protection ultimately accomplished the opposite. The evidence remained. The investigation remained. The determination remained. Only technology changed. And that change altered everything. The murder that once symbolized frustration became a landmark example of successful cold case investigation. It proved that justice may move slowly. Sometimes painfully slowly. But slow justice is not the same as absent justice. As the courtroom prepared for the final resolution, one truth stood above every legal argument, every scientific report, and every passing year. Sherry Black's story had not ended in 1970. It had continued through every detective who opened the file. Every scientist who examined the evidence. Every family member who refused to lose hope. Every advancement that brought investigators one step closer to the truth. The silence that surrounded her murder for nearly half a century had finally been broken. Not by rumor. Not by chance. But by evidence that had waited patiently for 46 years to identify the man who believed history had forgotten him. By the time the investigation reached its final chapter, the murder of Sherry Black had already secured its place in Utah's history. For decades, it had been introduced with the same description. An unsolved homicide. A cold case. A mystery that refused to yield answers. Now, after 46 years, those words no longer define the story. The case had transformed into something entirely different. It had become one of the clearest demonstrations that justice is not measured by speed. It is measured by persistence. The legal proceedings represented the culmination of thousands of hours of work performed by people separated by generations. The detectives who first responded in 1970 could never have imagined how the investigation would finally be resolved. They had relied upon the finest investigative methods available to them. They photographed the crime scene, collected physical evidence, interviewed witnesses, documented every observable fact. Those actions, routine at the time, ultimately became extraordinary. Because they preserved the future. Every carefully labeled exhibit became an investment in a technology that did not yet exist. Every report became a guide for investigators who had not yet begun their careers. The significance of that effort extended far beyond a single case. Across the United States, police departments reviewed thousands of unsolved homicides from previous decades. Many agencies realized that evidence once considered exhausted deserved another look. The Sherry Black investigation stood as powerful proof that careful evidence preservation can bridge generations. The case also reshaped public understanding of cold case investigations. Many people imagine that detectives simply reopen an old file and suddenly discover a forgotten clue. Reality is far more demanding. A successful cold case investigation requires patience measured in years, sometimes decades. Investigators must reconstruct events from another era. They must evaluate aging evidence under modern scientific standards. They must distinguish documented fact from fading memory. Above all, they must resist the temptation to force conclusions unsupported by evidence. That discipline defined the investigation into Sherry Black's murder. The renewed inquiry did not succeed because investigators guessed correctly. It succeeded because they allowed evidence to lead every decision. Scientific analysis established the foundation. Historical records supplied context. Traditional detective work completed the picture. Together, those elements formed an investigation capable of surviving legal scrutiny despite the extraordinary passage of time. For Sherry Black's loved ones, the outcome represented something impossible to quantify. No verdict could restore 46 lost years. No courtroom could return birthdays missed or conversations never shared. Justice cannot reverse tragedy. Its purpose is different. Justice recognizes the value of the life that was taken. It affirms that the victim has not been forgotten. It tells surviving family members that society refused to abandon the search for truth. That message carries profound meaning after nearly half a century. Many families connected to unsolved murders eventually fear that public interest will disappear. Media attention fades. Investigators retire. New crimes dominate headlines. The fear is understandable. But the Sherry Black case demonstrated another possibility. A file stored quietly inside an evidence room can still matter. A detective assigned decades later can still care deeply about a victim never personally known. Science developed years after the crime can still speak for someone whose voice was silenced long ago. Throughout the investigation, one lesson emerged repeatedly. Criminals often misunderstand time. Many believe surviving the initial investigation guarantees permanent freedom. They assume evidence deteriorates beyond usefulness. They assume memories disappear forever. They assume investigators eventually stop looking. Sometimes those assumptions prove true. But increasingly, they do not. Modern forensic science has transformed the meaning of time. Advances in DNA technology continue expanding the ability of investigators to identify individuals from increasingly small biological samples. Methods unimaginable in 1970 have become standard practice. Tomorrow's techniques may prove even more powerful. The implication is clear. Evidence preserved today may solve crimes far into the future. That realization has changed policing worldwide. Cold case units have expanded. Evidence storage standards have improved. Investigators now preserve material with future technologies in mind rather than limiting expectations to current capabilities. The Sherry Black investigation became an important example of why that philosophy matters. It also demonstrated something equally significant. Justice is rarely the work of one individual. Popular culture often celebrates a single detective solving an impossible mystery. Real investigations are different. They depend upon collaboration. Uniformed officers, crime scene technicians, laboratory analysts, detectives, evidence custodians, prosecutors, medical examiners. Each contributes a piece. The final result belongs to all of them. The resolution of Sherry Black's murder reflected that collective effort. Every generation carried the investigation one step farther. None completed it alone. The story also challenged assumptions about forgotten victims. Cold cases sometimes create the illusion that victims vanish into history. But every preserved file represents a promise. A promise that the search for truth has not ended. Sherry Black's name remained inside police records for 46 years not because investigators accepted failure. It remained because they refused to erase the possibility of success. When modern science finally identified Douglas Lovell, that promise was fulfilled. The identification did more than resolve one investigation. It restored confidence in the broader mission of cold case work. Across law enforcement, detectives viewed the case as encouragement. Evidence matters. Documentation matters. Patience matters. The future may solve problems the present cannot. For the broader public, the investigation carried another lesson. Justice is often invisible. Most investigative work happens away from cameras. Inside laboratories. Evidence rooms. Interview offices. Court filings. The dramatic moment arrives only after countless ordinary hours of careful, methodical effort. The Sherry Black case reflected exactly that reality. No miracles solved the murder. Preparation did. Discipline did. Scientific progress did. As the proceedings approached their conclusion, attention gradually shifted away from the mystery itself. The question of identity had been answered. The unknown killer was no longer unknown. Instead, the focus returned to the person whose life had been interrupted so violently in November 1970. Sherry Black. Her story had begun as the story of a young woman. It became the story of one of Utah's longest unsolved murders. Now, at last, it had become the story of perseverance. Of investigators who refused to surrender. Of a family who never stopped hoping. Of evidence that remained faithful to the truth across 46 extraordinary years. The silence that had once surrounded her death had finally been replaced by something stronger. An answer. Long delayed. Painfully earned. But unmistakably real. And as the final chapter of the legal process came into view, one last question remained. Not who had committed the crime. Not whether the evidence was sufficient. Those questions had finally been answered. The remaining question was how history would remember a case that proved one enduring truth. No matter how many years pass, a murder is never truly buried while the evidence still has a story to tell. On the surface, the story of Sherry Black appears to end where every homicide investigation hopes to end. A victim. An investigation. A breakthrough. A name. Justice pursued after decades of uncertainty. But when the courtroom grows quiet and the headlines disappear, another story remains. It is the story of time. 46 years. Nearly half a century between the moment violence shattered a quiet home in Salt Lake City and the moment modern science finally revealed the identity of the man responsible. Those 46 years cannot be measured simply by calendars. They are measured in lives changed forever. For Sherry Black's family, every passing year carried the same unanswered question. Who did this? Children grew into adults. Parents became elderly. Some family members did not live long enough to witness the case's resolution. That is one of the cruelest realities of delayed justice. Time gives investigators new technology. It also takes away opportunities. Opportunities for witnesses to remember clearly. For loved ones to receive answers while they are still alive. For victims to be remembered as people instead of case numbers. Yet despite those losses, the investigation proved something remarkable. Persistence can outlast silence. The detectives who first entered Sherry Black's home in November 1970 could not solve the murder. Not because they lacked determination. Not because they overlooked the evidence. But because the scientific tools necessary to identify the killer simply did not exist. It is easy, decades later, to underestimate the challenges investigators faced. Today, DNA analysis has become a familiar part of criminal investigations. In 1970, such technology belonged to the realm of imagination. Police relied on fingerprints, witnesses, physical observations, traditional investigative methods. They worked with the best resources available to them. Most importantly, they preserved the evidence. That decision became their greatest contribution to the future. Without those carefully collected exhibits, there would have been no breakthrough decades later. The investigation reminds us that justice is often built upon acts of professionalism that receive little public attention. An evidence technician carefully sealing an item. A detective documenting a room in detail. A laboratory employee preserving biological material year after year. None of those actions make headlines. Yet together they created the possibility that truth would eventually emerge. The story of Sherry Black is therefore not only the story of one murder. It is also the story of countless professionals who believed that no victim should ever be abandoned simply because science had not yet caught up. The identification of Douglas Lovell demonstrated how dramatically forensic science has transformed criminal investigations. The same biological evidence that investigators collected in 1970 eventually became the key to identifying the killer. Time, which once seemed to protect him, ultimately worked against him. Every passing decade improved the tools available to investigators. Every advancement narrowed the distance between the evidence and the truth. That lesson reaches far beyond this single case. Across the world, police agencies continue reopening unsolved murders from previous generations. Boxes of forgotten evidence are being examined again. Old homicide files are leaving storage shelves. Families who had almost given up hope are receiving unexpected phone calls. Some investigations still end without answers. Others, like Sherry Black's, finally reach the truth. The difference often lies in one simple decision made years earlier. To preserve the evidence. For investigators, the case reinforced an enduring principle. No homicide should ever be considered beyond hope. Not while evidence survives. Not while science continues advancing. Not while someone remains willing to reopen the file. Cold cases demand extraordinary patience. They also demand humility. Every generation of detectives must recognize that future investigators may possess tools unavailable today. That understanding changes the way evidence is collected, the way it is stored, the way it is protected. The Sherry Black investigation became a powerful reminder that today's routine procedure may become tomorrow's breakthrough. For the public, the case challenged another assumption. Many people believe justice is immediate or it does not exist at all. Reality is more complicated. Justice sometimes arrives years late. Sometimes decades late. It cannot restore the past. It cannot erase grief. But it can acknowledge truth. It can identify responsibility. It can affirm that a victim's life mattered enough for strangers, separated by generations, to continue searching for answers. Perhaps that is the greatest legacy of this investigation. Not simply that a murderer was identified, but that a promise was kept. The promise that Sherry Black would not become just another forgotten name inside an archive. Her story survived because people refused to stop asking questions. Because evidence was preserved. Because science evolved. Because determination outlasted despair. When historians look back on the investigation, they will undoubtedly remember it as one of Utah's landmark cold case resolutions. Law enforcement agencies will study it as an example of successful long-term evidence preservation. Forensic scientists will point to it as proof of how modern DNA analysis has transformed criminal justice. Families of victims will remember something else. Hope. Hope that even after decades of silence, answers remain possible. Hope that the passage of time does not always belong to the offender. Hope that forgotten evidence can still speak. As the years continue moving forward, the neighborhood where Sherry Black lived has changed. The world surrounding that house has changed. The people who investigated the original crime have largely passed the torch to a new generation. Yet one thing remains exactly as it was on the day the investigation began. The value of a human life. That value never diminished. Not after 1 year. Not after 10. Not after 46. And that is why the search continued. The murder of Sherry Black began with violence inside an ordinary home. It continued through decades of uncertainty, unanswered questions, and relentless determination. It ended not because the mystery faded, but because the truth endured longer than the silence surrounding it. In the end, the case offered no miracle. Only evidence. No legend. Only facts. No perfect ending. Only accountability pursued after an extraordinary wait. For Sherry Black, justice arrived far later than anyone could have imagined. For the investigators who refused to abandon her case, it was proof that careful work can echo across generations. For every family still waiting for answers in another cold case somewhere else, it became something even more important. A reminder that the passage of time does not always bury the truth. Sometimes it protects it. Sometimes it preserves it. And sometimes, when science is finally ready to listen, the smallest piece of forgotten evidence becomes the loudest voice in the room. That voice carried Sherry Black's story across 46 years. It survived changing detectives, changing technology, changing generations. It survived silence itself. And in the end, after nearly half a century, it accomplished what every victim deserves. It told the truth.